In this talk, I'm planning to look at some features of the OED over the past century or so. My general thesis is that, firstly, users of the first edition of the OED were presented with a dictionary necessarily and yet skillfully based on a rather small sample of data, and that, secondly, this data was typically edited with an underlying emphasis in today's terms on etymology. I'm not planning to talk about the second edition of the OED, published in 1989, which was essentially an amalgamation of earlier work and, very importantly, an opportunity for the full text of the dictionary to be published from machine-readable data for the first, as a first phase of a major revision and update of the dictionary. The third edition, on which I and my colleagues are currently working, offers opportunities to evolve from the lookup-based model of the dictionary, such as OED 1, and I hope to illustrate how historical dictionaries in general are moving from being vehicles in which information is looked up to ones which can also provide more outward-looking information on networks of words, both in English and other languages, and can offer consolidated information about the language as a whole, rather than simply on individual words. To do this, I'm using the OED as my example dictionary, but I'm sure you're all aware that this evolutionary trajectory is equally shared by most other historical dictionaries today. Sometimes the OED is ahead of the game, and sometimes it's back in the pack. And I'm going to finish with some breaking news of a new development at the OED, which I hope will be of interest to all of you, and which, in my view, is one of the most significant developments for the OED in its 130-year history. But to begin at the beginning, well, this is just a slide of the current OED 3 entry for hello. Curious that in a little note, it says that the use of hello when answering a telephone was popularised by Thomas Edison, but his rival, Alexander Graham Bell, preferred ahoy to be used. But we seem to have got over that by now. Anyway, first of all, a bit of background. I know there are some of you here who have written several books on the OED, and others of you who aren't particularly interested in the OED and possibly think it stands for Office of Economic Development. The three major publication points, 1884 to 1928, the New English Dictionary, now known as OED 1, was published. OED 2 was published in 1989, and this consisted of OED 1, the first edition, plus the contents of the 4-volume supplement to the OED, which was published in the 1970s and 80s, and on which I was first taken on to work. The second edition also included an additional 5,000 new words and sentences, which we edited in the late 1980s. They often came from the early part of the alphabet, because, as usual, dictionaries are typically less complete in the early part of the alphabet than in the later one. And so when they supplement in what Onions, I think, referred to as a wedge-shaped supplement. And the second edition also included the International Phonetic Alphabet for its transcriptions. Murray's old transcriptions were converted automatically into IPA. Well, converted automatically and then checked manually. But I'm not talking about that particularly because effectively OED 2 is phase 1 of the current revision project. It was an editorial project, but it was also, probably more significantly, a computational project. And the third edition of the OED started to be published in the year 2000, and is the second phase of the revision project in which we actually started publishing revisions and updates to the dictionary. So that's a very, very brief summary. Read any of the numerous books on the OED for the slightly fuller version. I'm going to say a little bit about OED 1. The headline features of the scope and philosophy of the first edition of the dictionary were that it should be a comprehensive and detailed word-based coverage of the English language. And I wanted to emphasize the word-based because one of the drifts of this talk is that we start off from word-based reference works moving to ones that look outwards more at the language as a whole. So OED 1 and dictionaries at the time were very largely word-based. You looked up a word and you found the information you wanted. One of the features of the OED, along with other international historical dictionaries of the time in the 19th century, was its historical approach to language development, and the fact that it based its entries on printed and manuscript sources. Now that's all fairly well known to anybody who knows about the OED, but I want to compare that later on to what our headline features are. I said that we were a look-up word. The first edition was very much a look-up dictionary. You had a word that you wanted to look up in the dictionary, and you could then find out information out about it. That clearly still continues as a major feature of the dictionary. One of the dictionary's correspondents a few weeks ago was working on a deposition made in Durham in 1686 to do with mines, and if you can read the screen, it says in the text at the top, in this deponent's judgment, it was impossible for the plaintiffs, keekers or agents in the same common road to take an account which was the defendant's, etc., etc. Anyway, the word keekers was something that puzzled this researcher, and he couldn't find it in the OED, couldn't find it in the English Dialect Dictionary, which is the other obvious place to look, and so wrote to us. Now, one of the things you know if you work on the OED is that it's not that everything's there, but more or less everything's there. And if somebody's writing in about a word, the likelihood is it's hidden away in the dictionary somewhere. And without much difficulty, I was able to find keeker, which had been spelt with an EA, under K-E-E-K-E-R in the OED, Northern Dialects term, defined initially as a peeper, a gazer, in plural the eyes, the peepers, the keekers, specifically, and this was the interesting part, an overlooker or inspector in a coal pit who sees that the coal is sent up in a proper state. Now the interesting thing to me about this quotation was that it provided 30-year antedating of the term from a manuscript source, because the OED gives the first reference to a Scottish source from the early 19th century. Although by 1893 it is citing a Durham directory where somebody is described as a keeker. J. Bennett is described as a keeker. So this is typical of the way the OED has been used historically. Terribly useful for us when people send in this sort of manuscript information, and there's an awful lot of, as you know, an awful lot of information about words in manuscripts that hasn't yet been collected for the OED or other national dictionaries. And also the dictionary is useful to the correspondent because we're able to give him what the OED said was the meaning of a word which he, I think, probably thought wasn't in any dictionary. He's probably a bit disappointed, actually, that we were able to tell him what it was. He thought he'd probably told us something new. But you feel it's awful when you have to upset people sometimes by... Anyway, can't worry about that all the time. One of the other key ways in which OED1 was used was as a source of information found in footnotes to literary texts. This was, we'll all have been familiar with this in our academic past. This is part of the text of Love's Labour's Lost, and various times in the detailed footnotes OED is referred to. Just reinforcing the look-up nature of information available in the first edition of the OED. Now, the famous picture of James Murray, several days before his death, togged up and working in the scriptorium on the OED. I normally show this picture as to indicate the sort of stereotype of the lexicographer in the 19th century. But this time I want to concentrate more on the number of index cards that Murray's got round him. I should preface it by saying that today's OED editors have got enormous respect for the work of their predecessors, including Murray, in the late 19th and early 20th century. If there's some ambiguity about a word in a quotation which we're analysing, used in the first edition of the dictionary, or a question of the structure of an entry arises, then we'll think very hard before changing the original editor's decision. That doesn't mean we don't make changes, but we're well aware of the skills and intuition which the original editors possessed. There are times, though not all the time, when we feel as if we're like dwarfs with a paintbrush sitting on the shoulders of giants painting the Forth Bridge. But fortunately we don't always feel that, or we'd have our overalls on. There There were big challenges, obviously, for the editors of the first edition of the dictionary. It was a very, very risky business, whether they'd ever complete, whether they'd ever get the thing going at all at one point. And any number nowadays relating to the OED is naturally very high. One of the often cited numbers about the first edition of the dictionary is that the OED's card files eventually contained 5 million index cards, of which just under 2 million were used in the first edition of the dictionary. And these are the index cards behind Murray on the, in the scriptorium. And at the time, these figures do seem enormous, but they bear a little bit of investigation. The total of 5 million index cards relates to the end of the project. Numbers were, were increasing up to that point, so they weren't always 5 million, they started off with 0. The finished dictionary contains about 180,000 main entries and many more subsenses and nested compounds and derivatives. And yet this means, by simple arithmetic, that even at the end of the period of compilation, and if all of those 5 million cards were relevant to entries that were in the dictionary, then there were on average only 28 cards available per entry for the editors. Clearly some will only have had one card and some would have had more. But we're really dealing in very small figures here for the amount of data that was available to the editors, although they could, of course, go to concordances and other sources looking for more information about words. It's all very restricted compared to the amount of data we've got now. So it's hardly surprising that quite soon, well, I think in 1900, Murray stated that he felt that 75% of the entries in the OED could be antedated with earlier documentation. It's just worth bearing in mind that it actually is, on average, a very small number of index cards that was available to the editors each time they were working on an entry. And I would certainly bear out that fact from working on the supplement to the OED in the 70s and 80s. We had a little bundle of index slips we were given for, say, 30 entries we had to, or 30 senses, say, that we had to work on. So quite a small amount of material. Now, one of the implications of that is that there's actually not very much documentation, especially in the early part of the first edition of the dictionary, published from the 1884 onwards, for some of the basic words of the language. Here we are. Here's the entry for bracket, which would have been published in the late 1880s. And several subsenses in black, but really very small paragraphs of quotations, one quotation from every century, perhaps, ending at the end in the 19th century, clearly, because that was when the dictionary was being produced. Not really very much material at all. And as we've seen, there weren't very many other cards as well as this that were in the dictionary store that they could have used. So actually it's remarkable how they managed to fashion such an authoritative document from really quite a small amount of data. One of the other things I wanted to talk about as relating to the first edition of the OED, and it's partially related to the fact of not having very much data, can be seen in an entry like Pontiff. And I want to talk about the ordering of the senses of Pontiff, and this is the entry from the first edition of the OED. It was published in about 1904, 1905. You can see that there are 3 senses, 1, 2, and 3. The first sense is a classical Roman sense, where Pontiff simply means a kind of priest. Sense 2 is a bishop, especially the bishop, or usually the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And the third sense is a general sense for any high priest or chief in any religion. And firstly, you'll notice that although the OED is a historical dictionary, and in general, the idea is that senses shall be presented in chronological sequence, the third sense here is not recorded until 1610, although the other 2 senses are later and in sequence. So there's a different ordering system, structuring system coming into play here, and Murray, who as well as editing those entries in A, etc., also edited P as well, he has decided to put what he regards as probably the etymological and the proper older sense of the word first, even though that's not reflected in the evidence that's available to them. It's as if the evidence had been available to the editors, that was what would have been the first sense, and it would have tied in also with the etymological sense of the word. That's really quite a strong feeling, in especially the very first part of the first edition of the OED, but it does carry throughout the dictionary. There's a very strong etymological undercurrent to the structure of the entries in the first edition of the OED. And this is reflected quite strongly, not just in the etymologies that the editors presented, but also in the sequencing of senses and the content of definitions even. This is one of Murray's earliest definitions, and the reason I wanted to show you this was to show that there is again in the first edition a very heavy emphasis on etymology in even the definitions of words. Now, the etymology of accurate, it comes from ad curare, curare to care, and it certainly wouldn't be the case today. I mean, I haven't checked more contemporary dictionaries, but you see the first definition, executed with care, careful, obsolete in the general sense. I've missed out the quotations in this slide. Of things and persons, precise, exact, precise, correct, as a result of care. There's a constant battering the reader to remember what the etymological link with these senses is. And when you get to the final sense, it's the reverse of that, of things without special reference to the evidence of care, etc., which is more the modern sense now. There was a very strong feeling throughout the dictionary that you had to take enormous or consider with enormous respect the etymological background of a word. Now, as I said, I don't really want to talk about the second edition of the OED because that wasn't a large-scale editorial revision, but there was the first phase of what we're doing at the moment. You remember I showed you a card showing what I regarded as the outline, headline, scope and philosophy of the first edition of the dictionary. Well, doing the same for the third edition, they're essentially the same sort of features. I've more or less copied the slide and added one line at the end. I've taken out word-based from the first point, but we still intend, as far as we can, a comprehensive and detailed coverage of the English language, historical approach to language development, basing it on print, manuscript, but also now on online sources. But there's very much a feeling now, and this has happened since the development of machine-readable dictionaries, corpus linguistics, etc. And very much a feeling of looking outwards, looking through a telescope the other way, and looking out towards the language and towards other words in the language, rather than just down in towards the word that you're actually working on as an editor or interested in as a user. Some more detailed information about the work we're actually doing at the moment. I and 70 other in-house editors working principally in Oxford, although some in New York, lexicographers, researchers, etc., are working to comprehensively revise the second edition of the OED, which, as we saw, was an amalgamation of the earlier published text of the dictionary. 21,000 pages, published over 20 volumes in 1989, although principally containing text from a much earlier date. We're doing this with about 300 specialist advisors to whom we send entries when we've worked them up to what we regard as a publishable standard for their final corrections. Numerous external contributors, that means the general public, who are always sending us pieces of information we sometimes already know and sometimes don't know, often anti-datings of text that's already in the dictionary. Very useful. It's been a central part of the OED's development since the earliest days, that information has been provided to us by members of the public. And at the moment, the revision of the OED as OED 3 published online is about 27% complete. And I mentioned at the end, it's funded by the University Press, by the University of Oxford, which is surprising to some people because many foreign continental national dictionaries don't have the funding of a university, but often have funding from a more national state or government institution. So that's the outline job we're doing at the moment. This is an entry from the first edition of the OED, the entry for Englishism, and I was just going to show you some of the sort of areas that we'll be looking to revise just on the face of it when you come across this entry, and it's in your range for working. There's a label here saying rare. There's only a small number of quotations here over 25 years, so we'll be looking at whether there's further documentation, which means that maybe the word is no longer rare. Was it rare at the time? Should we retain the label? We've got an British English pronunciation, converted from Murray's this would be about 1890, his pronunciation. Should we be updating that pronunciation, keeping a note of the older pronunciation, adding an American pronunciation, as we tend to do these days as well? Is the etymology sufficient? Is there more information you need? There aren't very many quotations for this particular word, and the editors have decided to put all of the quotations except for one or two in one sense and given it a sort of catch-all definition in various occasional senses, the characteristics peculiar to the English modes of procedure, a manifestation or product of English character, attachment to what is English. They could have probably gone on for several more lines, interpreting the information on a case-by-case basis for each of those quotations from Tate's Magazine down to the Indian Daily News. And the second sense, for which they've only got two examples, is defined as an English idiom or form of speech. First quote, always rather sad when a first quote comes from a dictionary. This is from Funk's Standard Dictionary, because you tend to think there's bound to be usage before that hasn't been picked up. So for the editor, there aren't big questions of etymology, of encyclopedic fact for this particular entry, and it's a fairly routine sort of entry, but you can see that those are the sort of questions that the editors will be asking themselves when they come to it, along with the other 100 or 150 entries they may be working on at the same time. And this roughly is what happens to the entry after it's been revised. The quotations that are underlined are the new ones that we've added in the current revision. We haven't changed the head word, we haven't changed the part of speech, we've added an American pronunciation. We've tied it in with the entry for Anglicism, which is elsewhere in the dictionary, which the previous entry from the first edition didn't do, although I think they had an entry for Anglicism. But again, we want to try to sort of compare between words as much as just look at words themselves. We've decided to branch the entry to three senses. The most familiar one to us maybe is this English idiom or form of speech equals Anglicism. Again, looking out to another entry rather than it was into itself. And we've managed to find a quotation that predates Funk's dictionary, and it's from Crabb Robinson from 1804. But in the context, it's used as a sort of rough translation of a German word, which is perhaps not surprising. English speakers may not talk about Englishisms or may not recognise Englishisms themselves, so the term is quite likely to be imposed externally. So I think that's possibly acceptable. There are later examples as well. The word has lost its label saying rare because it's no longer rare. There's plenty of evidence for a number of senses, including this third sense here, which has been extracted out of the old first sense, where this quote from Kay was there, with another quote from him. And two earlier quotations before Tate's Magazine's 1855 have been provided for the word as well. In this case, both from women, from Fanny Burney and from Mrs. Humphrey Wood, although we don't try to indicate whether it's indicative of the word that it's first recorded in the OED by two female authors. I think that's beyond our scope, really. But those are the sort of questions we ask ourselves when we're revising, we come to revise an entry. I have always had to choose as an example of this sort of thing, a very short entry. It's quite difficult to find a good short entry of the OED because most of them, especially by the time they've been revised, have become quite long and detailed but informative. Now, I'm afraid this this is the timeline of what we've been doing for the last 15 years. It reminds me of when I used to have a fuzzy felt set when I was younger, and because building these things onto a PowerPoint slide with text boxes is, I'm sorry it looks so amateurish. Anyway, going quickly through it, it was in 1993, 1994 that the OED3 project was approved. We immediately started working on the policy, developing the policy for the dictionary, which actually took quite a long time, working out precisely how we dared differ from what the original dictionary had used as its policy. We had to recruit and train staff, which again was a complicated issue. If you remember, before this time, before 1994, we've been working on the supplement to the OED, which was a dictionary largely of contemporary English, at least 19th and 20th century dictionary work, moving back to the complete panorama of the history of English was quite a jolt for some lexicographers. So there was quite a lot of training and recruiting to do. At this time, we had a deadline of 2005, which is there, to complete the dictionary. We're now here. And because that was the case, we started editing straight away. We started at the letter M because we knew that the content of the dictionary was the first edition of the dictionary was quite stable by then. And we actually got about 25% of the way through the dictionary in first draft by about 1998, 1999. And that was an enormous amount of work. A small amount of that was edited to publishable standard, but actually most of it wasn't. We were just trying to get through the work before 2005 because that was the deadline deemed by the press for our publication. And then we came to something of a halt in 1999 because largely as a result of our encouragement, the press decided that it would be a good idea to publish the OED online, and we'd been developing a prototype online version before then. And our editing, we had to start then finalising all of the material that we'd already been working on up to this point, and we decided to publish online from the year 2000 with a small amount of entries, 1,000 I think it was in the first batch, and gradually increasing and seeing how we could develop the progress and the trajectory of the project as we went on. It took longer than we expected because of this. There's not exactly an elephant in the room because everybody knows about it, but the enormous growth in historical databases, which meant that we had to review an awful lot of material that was becoming available on the internet from around about here onwards, to incorporate much of that material into our entries, because if we just published the entries in the state that we'd left them, say in 1995, the early entries in the letter M, we would have been pilloried in the press as soon as academics realised that there were large historical databases out there with much earlier information than we had in our revised entries, in which we've been working in much the way Murray had been working, I suppose, on using index cards that had built up in the department. But these are small numbers compared with the information that's available on the internet. So we started re-editing. We changed our procedure. We started adding new words outside the M sequence in 2003. We had a new computer system in 2005, which does which speeds things up and offers the promise of speeding things up in the future really quite substantially. Previously, we had from here we had a computer system which was very good in our own terms, but was no longer supportable. And we got to the stage that if the lights had gone out one day, we wouldn't have really been able to carry on and almost retrieve what we had. Anyway, so by now we're 27% complete. We haven't got a final completion date in mind at the moment because we really want to see how much faster we can make things go with the new editorial computer system and more efficient practices in terms of the use of online databases. We can't look at every database that's available there. We have to. So we're still trying to find out how effective we can be. So, but I suspect it's going to be in the 15, 20 years or so before we reach the end. A little bit about the new computer system that we started working with in 2005. The difference between this and the previous computer system is that this has a whole series of linked modules. One module for editing, one for bibliography, one for library research, one for managing the editors, how much work the editors were doing and how they were recording it, one for searching corpus data, etc. And the previous system, these are all separate modules. Here they're all interlinked. So, and it also allows you to automatically update subsenses, cross-references, etc. I remember when we were working on make, which was the first big entry we hit in M, and we wanted to change sense. We did change around sense, move sense 60, say, to sense 20. An enormous amount of changing of sense numbers all had to be done by hand. It was an absolute nightmare. It would take a day sometimes to make good the damage you've done by making some small change to the entry. And that's all looked after automatically now. This is a screenshot of the current software. This is the XML data in glorious Technicolor, which the editors key into. They can key into this, which is a sort of pretty print version of it. This is the entry for Ragbolt, which is it's been published recently. This panel here is the adjacent entries and whatever other entries you've got in your editorial store that you'll be working on next. I wanted to show you this side over here. This side here is linked to this quotation here, and the editor, when working on this quotation, has wanted to have it converted to a manuscript in the British Library, and so has filled in a form here, pressed a button, and it's gone off to London to be checked, and the library researcher has made these changes, sent it back to the editor, ping on the screen, and the editor then incorporates those changes into the entry. Much more efficient way of conducting this sort of checking than the old days, which was very largely, as usual, card-based. Everything was card-based in the old days. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the text editor. It's just one of the components of the system, integrated with the bibliography manager, for example, as well. But it's a much more efficient system than the one we had before. Looking at how we handle the structure of entries on OED3, this is the entry of a camera, as in OED1, the original entry of camera, and you can see that the order of sense is sense 1A in Latin sense, and sense 1B used in the Latin law. This is, again, very much an etymological development. The etymological meaning of, or the original Latin meaning of camera is given as vault, arched chamber, and here they turn up in the first sense in the OED. It's almost as if the entry has to represent the word's overall developmental structure rather than its developmental structure in English, which is actually what we're concerned with. Second sense reference to Italy and Spain, a chamber or a legislative chamber, department of the papal curia. And then you move on to some technical senses, short for the camera obscura, and S for that form used in photography, which is really rather a slim way of defining something that's become a major element of a modern entertainment lifestyle, and then a television sense for television camera. Now it's curious in this case that the etymological sequence, these are the dates of the first use, 1708, 1712, etc., follow a chronological order. We've now got an entry in draft, in revision, and the sequence following the evidence rather than a preconceived etymological ordering takes the papal curia department as the earliest, 150 years or so earlier than we previously thought the word existed. It's not surprising that the word came into English in a specific sense, and that's one of the nice things about describing the sequence based on the evidence, because there would perhaps not have been much use for a word camera, meaning a room, in English in the 16th or 17th century, but there is a reason for a word that means something specific at the papal curia. So anyway, you can see that sense 2 is this arched vault. Then we move to the technical senses. The definition of camera slightly extended with references to digital cameras and also links to other types of camera elsewhere in the dictionary, again looking out, and the television camera has similar links to references there. So strict chronological sequencing and an order that isn't etymological, but makes you think about what the real, whether this evidence represents the real sequence of introductions of senses into English, which I think is important. This is the entry I showed you before for Pontiff, where the senses are out of sequence. We've revised this entry now, and we've changed the order of senses. It's a much earlier word than OED1 thought. We start off with the Bishop of the Western Church, the Pope, at a time when there was a certain amount of conflict in Britain with the Pope, so not unusual that this word might arise. Then a more general sense, and then only later, the last sense here recorded, the ancient Roman sense. Now, it's possible that somebody can send us a piece of documentation tomorrow which will change this sequence, and we'll have to look into how we should do that if that happens. But it does seem that it feels to us that it represents the evidence of the language, and that we're better able to do that with a larger amount of data that we've got available to us these days. But we're also trying to look out not just at other, not just within English, but we're also trying to look from a word out to other languages, and where the word artificial, for example, fits into the European picture. And this is a summary of the information that you saw in the rather dense etymology from the OED just now. Essentially, the word artificial comes into English from Anglo-Norman or Middle French artificiel, various senses, skillfully made by art, human skill, cunning, seeking to deceive in the 16th century, but it also may come in from classical Latin. You can't necessarily tell whether a particular early use has been taken from Latin or from Anglo-Norman, or a sort of mental mixture of the two. The classical Latin senses tend to simply involve skill and art. What's interesting about these Anglo-Norman and Middle French senses is that by the time you get to the 16th century, you haven't got artificial just being made by art. You've got the sense of deception, artificiality and sham coming in. So this is happening in continental languages. And if you look at the entry for artificial further on down, and there wasn't room for it here, you find that English senses in the 16th century, around this sort of time, maybe a little bit later, the sense of deception starts to come into artificiality. So we're trying to show not just what happens to the word in English, but also what happens to the word in the other languages, often of Europe, but sometimes further afield at the same time. The documentation that we've got available to us these days, we've clearly got the old index cards from the old days. We've got access to a large number of databases. We haven't always had access to those databases. So when we started revising for the third edition at the letter M, we had available Literature Online, JSTOR, and ProQuest. As far as I can estimate, we had various other databases, Questia, for example, which is very good for 19th, 20th century book material, newspaper archive, American local newspapers back to well into the 19th century. We had that available to us from about the word one. This is moving from M onwards. Echo and Ebo, roundabout, somewhere in O, we had access to those first. Google Books a bit later, but it took us a while to get used to how to use Google Books well, because it's very dangerous bibliographically in some ways. British Library newspapers, 19th century local newspapers from the UK, terribly useful resource. We only had it from maybe Red or so onwards. We've only just published Red. We actually had access to this database a year earlier, 2 years earlier, when we were starting to work on it. And another area of from where we can take material these days, as in a web crawler, is from the internet. The first reference for computing terms is often going to be from computer files somewhere on the internet. There's no point in us just trying to quote from books, newspapers and magazines if the first reference is actually going to be an archived and acceptable web source. So we're trying to look out for all sorts of additional types of data. And we're also we've got one or two specialised sites. This is one that Jesse Scheidlauer manages or co-manages for science fiction terms. If you look up sci-fi and OED on Google, you'll get to this site. and if you happen to be reading a science fiction novel or magazine, Astounding Science Fiction or something, and come across an early example for Alien, then in the OED this will tell you how to send it to us, etc. It'd be nice to have this sort of thing for all sorts of subject areas, but we can't do everything at once. That's one of our problems on the dictionary. Now, I mentioned some breaking news. It's important for us, and I think it's important for you, that we're relaunching the OED online site in December this year. More about that this evening at the OEP reception, which I think you had information about. It's important for us because there are some big changes going on. At the moment, when you look at the OED online, you see the revised entries and also the OED2 entries. What we're providing now is the editor's working database to the OED. So a lot of changes that have happened to the database over the last 15 years because of standardized checkings and things, where we've decided to put that up. There's a risk in that, but we think it's better to give people information rather than, I mean, even if it's a bit ragged at the edges sometimes, than to conceal it until maybe 10 years' time when the entry is all perfectly edited. We'll be including, at the moment, the background information on the site isn't particularly about the language, it's more about the dictionary. We're planning to come up with a regular series of features of information features, articles about the dictionary and about the language, and we may well be asking anyone here to contribute articles to that, to broaden the scope of the dictionary from just the text of the dictionary to the language itself. You can see we've put here integration of the historical thesaurus of the OED, which was published in 2009. Christian Kay is here, one of the editors of that. We've been working on how to do that for a while, and it's been quite tricky. We're planning to integrate that with the dictionary so that so that the editors will be able, so that users will be able to make use of the new channels between words that this will allow. We're hoping to add more graphic information and additional functionality. I'm not going to go into details about that because there are better informed people on that going to do that this evening at OUP. This looks a very dreary slide. It's just part of the OED, not in a revised entry, somewhere in the entry for Lion. But the key point is that when we publish the working database, rather than getting the OED2 version of Lion, you'll get this version with a lot of, may look like silent corrections, but actually a lot of changes which will make searching easier. A lot of initials, for example, have been added on to authors. Dates sometimes changed based on the publication of individual works. Text changed when a term has been converted to an earlier edition. The old use of ibid or a double M dash to indicate that the short title is repeated has been got rid of, and we now repeat the Dryden Spanish Friar, so that that just helps searching. So there are all sorts of background changes happening to text, which you'll hardly be aware of, but will be there. We're also, in terms of graphical information, able to extract information. Sorry, this doesn't. Able to extract information from the dictionary and present it in a whole series of graphic illustrations. So this particular one, with a timeline down the left-hand side, shows you words that were borrowed into English from Japanese. And we've got an enhanced set of tagging in our etymologies these days that allows us to look just at the word, the language from which a word came immediately into English, rather than previously you got given all words that had the word Japanese somewhere in the etymology. Well, this shows that early, not very many. You can look at the blue as a sort of rough outline of a graph. Not many words in English from Japanese in the 17th century, and then effectively a sort of gap when Japan became a sort of closed country as far as the West was concerned. Picking up again into the 19th century, where the sorts of words that were borrowed into English from Japanese changed from being words that travellers going to court might come across to words of Japanese arts, martial arts, etc., the sort of things that were significant to the Western observer of Japan, or Western lover of things Japanese in the 19th century, and later some scientific terms as well. So for any language, we're hoping to be able to produce this sort of graphical information, not just for languages, for other aspects as well, and we take advice from users as to what sort of information they'd like to see. The important thing for me is that if we make a change to one of these entries, find an earlier example, the next quarter when the data goes up, it'll be revised, and the new information will be reflected in the graph that's presented. So we're hoping to produce a much more sort of dynamic and responsive and sort of living view of the language. And this, I think, is more or less my last slide, which shows you, I think there'll be more about this evening. I went into the entry for revolutionary and clicked a button that said thesaurus, and I got taken to the list on the right, which is a list of words from the 18th and 19th century that mean revolutionary in the OED. You can then click on them and go to the entry, or you can go to this, well, Christian K's basic thesaurus structure and go to other semantic areas, click on that and find the words that you want to go to, and then go to them, etc., 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 sort of continuing pathway through the dictionary, semantic pathway through the dictionary. We haven't finalised this yet. The dates aren't necessarily all in the right order by century over there. This is very much a prototype. But it's symptomatic of the way we're trying to look at the language outwards rather than inwards in future. And I mean, I wish we could have done this earlier. Tony here, you'll recognise this because it's one of her words of the day from the Dictionary of Old English quite recently for the equivalent of head bone. And Tony's, as you probably know, has been able for the last year or so to have links directly from her entries to the equivalent entries in the OED and also the Middle English Dictionary, which is great, obviously, if you've got subscriptions to those two dictionaries. And we're hoping to do the same thing for these other two dictionaries when we relaunch in December, so you'll be able to move, if there is an entry, from the OED entry for head to the Middle English Dictionary for head, which is, as always, spelt slightly differently. I hope just use the OED as a tool around the language rather than just at a particular word. So let me just check. That's the lot for today. Thank you very much.